Hey, what is up, everyone? I hope you guys are doing well. Today we have a unique story narrated by my friend Frederick. I hope you guys enjoy it and watch till the end, guys.
There are fates in the universe that exist beyond the comprehension of mortal minds. Destinies so terrible that death itself would be counted as mercy. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war and the cold laughter of thirsting gods, one particular doom stands above all others in its capacity to break not just the body, but the very essence of what makes us human. To be trapped in the warp is to experience every nightmare that has ever haunted humanity, multiplied beyond measure, stretched across eternities that may last only seconds or span millennia. The warp, the Imperium, the Sea of Souls, the realm of chaos. It has many names, and each speaks to a different aspect of this dimension that exists parallel to our own reality. It is not simply another place in space, not merely an alternate dimension that follows different physical laws. The warp is something far more fundamental and far more terrible. It is a realm where the thoughts and emotions of every sentient being in the galaxy gather and take form, where dreams become tangible and nightmares walk with purpose. It is a mirror held up to the collective psyche of all living things, reflecting back not the best of what we are, but the worst, the darkest, the most primal and violent impulses that lurk in the depths of consciousness. In the material universe, we are protected by the laws of physics, by cause and effect, by the stable progression of time from past to future. We understand that matter cannot simply appear from nothing, that time flows in one direction, that our thoughts remain locked within our skulls. These are the rules that make existence comprehensible, that allow us to navigate reality with some measure of confidence. But in the warp, all of these comforting certainties dissolve like salt in water. There, thought becomes reality. Emotion manifests as physical force. Time twists back upon itself or stretches into infinity. The impossible becomes not just possible, but inevitable. To be trapped in the warp is to be cast adrift in this ocean of madness with no anchor to reality, no protection from its corrosive influence, no hope of escape through conventional means. It is to watch as everything you know about existence is proven wrong, as the fundamental nature of reality itself becomes hostile to your continued survival. And unlike death, which offers the release of oblivion, being trapped in the warp means that consciousness persists, that you remain aware even as everything that makes you yourself is slowly stripped away, layer by layer, until nothing remains but screaming awareness in a universe of pain. The Imperium of man, that vast sprawling empire of 1,000,000 worlds spread across the galaxy, depends utterly on the warp for its survival. Without the ability to travel through this hellish dimension, humanity would be trapped on isolated worlds, unable to communicate across the vast distances of space, unable to maintain the cohesion that keeps the Imperium from fragmenting into 1,000,000 isolated kingdoms. Every day, thousands of ships enter the warp, trusting in ancient technology and prayer to protect them as they traverse its nightmarish currents. Most make it through safely, emerging at their destinations with crew and cargo intact, but some do not. Some are lost to warp storms that rage across the Immaterium like hurricanes across an ocean. Some are taken by the creatures that dwell within that realm, predators that hunger for the taste of mortal souls. And some simply vanish, swallowed by the warp without trace or explanation, their fates unknown but certainly terrible. Those who study such things, the learned scholars of the Adeptus Mechanicus and the grim inquisitors who guard against the threats that lie beyond reality, speak of the warp in hushed tones. They know that it is necessary, that humanity cannot survive without it, but they also know its true nature. They have seen what happens to those unfortunate enough to be exposed to its influence without protection. They have read the reports of ships that emerge from the warp with their crews transformed into things that were no longer human, or worse, with the crews still technically alive, but driven so far into madness that they could only scream and tear at their own flesh in desperate attempts to escape the memories of what they had experienced. The technology that allows humanity to survive warp travel is called the Geller field, a protective bubble of real space projected around a ship that keeps the warp at bay. It is ancient technology, dating back to the dark age of technology, when humanity first mastered the secrets of faster-than-light travel. The exact mechanisms by which it functions are not fully understood, even by the tech priests who maintain these devices. Some sources suggest that the fields are generated by psychers kept in induced comas, their dreaming minds creating a stable bubble of reality through unconscious psychic power. Others claim the technology is purely mechanical, relying on principles of physics that have been lost to time. What is known with absolute certainty is that the Geller field is the only thing standing between a ship's crew and the horrors that lurk in the warp. When a Geller field fails, even for a moment, the consequences are catastrophic. In the space of a heartbeat, the protective barrier between reality and the Imperium collapses. The warp floods into the ship like water into a breached hull, but this is not water that simply drowns. This is a tide of pure psychic energy, of concentrated emotion and malevolent intelligence, of demon stuff that warps and corrupts everything it touches. The air itself becomes thick with wrongness, heavy with a presence that presses against the mind and soul with physical weight. Those aboard the ship, when the field fails, experience the change instantly. The lights flicker and take on colors that shouldn't exist, hues that hurt to look at and linger in the vision like afterimages. The metal walls of the ship begin to sweat with substances that defy identification, viscous fluids that seem to move with purpose, that reach out toward crew members with pseudopods of glistening horror. The artificial gravity wavers, not simply failing but becoming variable, so that down might become up in one corridor while remaining down in another, or gravity might intensify until crew members are crushed flat against the deck, their bones snapping under their own weight. But the physical changes, terrible as they are, pale in comparison to what happens to the minds of those exposed. The warp is emotion made manifest, and it responds to the feelings of those within it, reflecting them back, amplified 1,000-fold. Fear begets terror. Anger becomes rage. Despair deepens into absolute hopelessness. Every negative emotion is seized upon by the denizens of the warp and used as a weapon against those who feel it. The crew begins to see things, hallucinations that are more real than reality, visions crafted from their deepest fears and darkest memories. A man might see his dead wife standing before him, her body twisted and broken as it was when he last saw it. But now she speaks, her voice accusing him of failures both real and imagined. A woman might watch her hands age before her eyes, the skin withering and the bones becoming visible beneath translucent flesh as decades pass in seconds. Children's laughter echoes through empty corridors, but the sound is wrong, too high-pitched and sharp, more like the cry of hunting birds than human joy. And these visions are not mere illusions that can be dismissed once recognized as false. In the warp, belief and reality are one and the same. If you believe the vision is real, then for you it is. The nature of the immaterium. To understand what happens when you become trapped in the warp, you must first understand what the warp actually is. It is not simply another dimension in the way that science fiction typically depicts such things. It is not an empty void waiting to be filled, not a blank canvas upon which travelers can impose their will. The warp is alive, in a sense, though not in any way that mortal beings would recognize as life. It is a reflection of the material universe, a mirror dimension that exists in parallel with real space, but follows entirely different rules. The warp is formed from psychic energy, the collective thoughts and emotions of every sentient being in the galaxy. When a human feels fear, that emotion does not simply dissipate into nothingness. It feeds into the warp. adding its particular flavor to the great ocean of psychic energy. When 1,000,000 humans feel fear simultaneously, that collective terror creates ripples and currents in the warp, forming patterns that can take on a kind of quasi-consciousness. When billions feel the same emotions over the course of millennia, those patterns can coalesce into something approaching true sentience, something that can think and plan and act with purpose. This is how the Chaos Gods were born. Khorne, the blood god, formed from untold ages of violence and rage, from every murder and every battle ever fought. Nurgle, the plague father, arose from despair and the fear of death, from the resignation with which mortals face the inevitability of decay. Tzeentch, the changer of ways, crystallized from hope and ambition, twisted into scheming and manipulation, from the desire for knowledge regardless of cost. And Slaanesh, the youngest of the four, burst into being from the depths of hedonism and excess, from desires pursued beyond all reason or restraint. These are not gods in the traditional sense. They do not exist outside of the universe, observing from some higher plane. They are part of the universe, intrinsic to its nature as gravity or electromagnetism. They are the collective, unconscious, given form and purpose, the darkness that lurks in every sentient heart made manifest. And they hunger eternally for the souls of mortals, for each soul consumed adds to their power, feeding them with the psychic energy that sustains their existence. But the Chaos Gods are not the only inhabitants of the warp. The Imperium teems with lesser entities, creatures formed from specific emotions or concepts, demons that exist to embody particular aspects of mortal experience. There are demons of rage that appear as towering warriors clad in brass and skull, their forms rippling with barely contained violence. There are demons of despair that take the shape of bloated, rotting things that spread disease with their very presence. There are demons of desire that manifest as impossibly beautiful beings whose very appearance is an assault on the senses, overwhelming in their perfection. And there are demons of change that shift and alter their forms constantly, never appearing the same way twice, their bodies a constant flux of mutation. Beyond even these categorized entities, there exist things in the warp that have no name, no purpose, beyond predation. These are the psychic predators, creatures that hunt through the Imperium, seeking the psychic signatures of mortal minds, drawn to consciousness like sharks to blood in water. They are hunger, given form, need made manifest, and they care nothing for the distinctions mortals make between good and evil, right and wrong. They simply consume, adding the energy of devoured souls to their own essence, growing stronger with each feeding. The warp itself is a constantly shifting environment. In real space, location is fixed. If you travel from point A to point B, you will always follow the same path through physical space. But in the warp, location is fluid. The distance between 2 points can vary wildly, depending on factors that mortal minds cannot fully comprehend. The psychic currents of the warp flow in patterns influenced by the emotions of sentient beings across the galaxy, and these patterns change constantly. A route that is safe one day might become impossibly dangerous the next, not because anything has physically moved, but because the emotional resonance of the region has shifted. This is why navigators are so crucial to warp travel. These rare individuals, mutants blessed or cursed with a third eye that can perceive the currents of the warp directly, serve as guides for ships traversing the Imperium. They can see the flows and eddies of psychic energy, can identify safe channels through the chaos, can steer a ship away from the most dangerous regions where the boundary between the warp and reality wears thin. Without navigators, ships must make short jumps through the warp, traveling only a few light years at a time before returning to real space to recalibrate and ensure they haven't drifted too far off course. But even with a navigator's guidance, warp travel is never truly safe. The Imperium is fundamentally hostile to mortal life. It is a dimension where the laws of physics that govern the material universe simply do not apply. Matter can appear from nothing or dissolve into nothing. Energy can manifest in forms that violate thermodynamics. Causality itself becomes uncertain, with effects preceding their causes or occurring simultaneously. Time, that most fundamental of all dimensions, becomes twisted and unreliable. In the warp, time does not flow at a constant rate. A ship might spend what seems to its crew to be a few days in the Imperium, only to emerge and discover that centuries have passed in real space. Conversely, a journey that subjectively takes months might deposit the travelers only hours after they departed, or even, in the most extreme cases, before they left. This temporal fluidity is one of the most disorienting aspects of warp travel, and it means that any attempt to maintain a coherent timeline across the Imperium is fundamentally impossible. Different worlds exist at different points in their own local timelines, with some having experienced more centuries since a particular event than others. The physical environment of the warp, to the extent that such a term can even be applied to a dimension of pure psychic energy, is nightmare made manifest. Those unfortunate enough to perceive the Immaterium directly describe visions that defy rational description. The landscape of the warp consists of impossible geometries, structures that extend in directions that do not exist in three-dimensional space, buildings and monuments constructed from solidified emotion and crystallized screams. Colors exist there that have no name, hues that the human eye was never meant to perceive, and the very act of seeing them causes pain that radiates from the optic nerve through the entire skull. The sky, if such a term can be used, is not a simple void dotted with stars. It is a roiling mass of psychic energy, clouds of rage that burn with crimson light, vast whirlpools of despair that pull at the soul like gravity pulls at matter, sheets of writhing pleasure pain that ripple and flow like aurora borealis, crafted from sensation rather than light. And through these phenomena move shapes, vast and terrible, entities so large that they could swallow suns, their forms constantly shifting and changing as they pursue purposes incomprehensible to mortal minds. The ground beneath one's feet, should one be so unfortunate as to find oneself walking through the warp rather than safely ensconced within a ship, is equally treacherous. It might appear solid, a surface of stone or metal or flesh, but this solidity is illusory. The ground can give way without warning, plunging the traveler into depths that have no bottom, or it can suddenly harden around limbs, trapping the victim in place while demons close in for the feast. The very air, if the warp can be said to have air, is thick with presence, with the psychic residue of a billion souls that have been consumed by the Immaterium over the eons. Perhaps most terrible of all is the fact that the warp is not simply hostile to mortals. It is actively malevolent. The chaos gods and their demon servants are not mindless forces of nature. They are intelligent, capable of planning and manipulation, and they delight in the suffering of mortal beings. When a ship becomes trapped in the warp, when its Geller field fails and leaves the crew exposed, the denizens of the Immaterium do not simply attack and consume. They play with their victims, drawing out the torment, feeding on the terror and despair that such treatment generates. This is the realm into which the unfortunate might find themselves cast. A dimension of pure chaos, where thought and reality are one, where time has no meaning, where the very environment seeks to corrupt and destroy. And once trapped within it, escape becomes not simply difficult, but potentially impossible. The warp does not easily release what it has claimed. Those who enter without the protection of a Geller field, or whose protection fails while they are within, find themselves fighting not just for their lives, but for their very souls. Entry into Nightmare: How you get trapped. The question of how one becomes trapped in the warp has many answers, each more terrible than the last. The Immaterium is not a place that people visit intentionally, not somewhere that travelers seek out for its own sake. It is a necessary evil, a means to an end, and every precaution is taken to minimize contact with its corrupting influence. Yet despite all these precautions, despite millennia of accumulated knowledge about how to traverse the warp safely, accidents happen. Technology fails. Calculations prove incorrect. The unpredictable currents of the Immerterium shift in ways that no navigator could have foreseen. And when these failures occur, when a ship finds itself stranded in the realm of chaos with no way to return to real space, the nightmare truly begins. The most common cause of becoming trapped in the warp is Geller field failure. These protective devices, ancient relics of technology that even the Adeptus Mechanicus does not fully understand, are maintained with religious fervor by the tech priests who serve aboard Imperial vessels. Every component is anointed with sacred oils and blessed with prayers to the machine spirit that supposedly dwells within. Incense is burned before the field generator, and litanies of activation are chanted as the device is powered up. Yet despite all this reverence, despite all the careful maintenance and ritual observance, the Geller field remains a machine, subject to the entropy that affects all physical things. When a Geller field fails, the transition is not gradual. There is no slow weakening that might give the crew time to react, no warning alarms that sound minutes before catastrophe strikes. One moment, the ship is cocooned in its bubble of real space, protected from the hostile environment of the warp. The next moment, that protection is gone, and the full force of the Immerterium floods into every corridor and compartment. The failure can have many causes. Sometimes it is simple mechanical breakdown, a component that reaches the end of its operational lifespan and ceases to function. The Geller field generators are complex devices, filled with parts that must work in perfect harmony to maintain the protective envelope. If even one critical component fails, the entire system can collapse. Other times, the failure is caused by external factors. A warp storm might batter the ship with such psychic force that the field generator cannot maintain its output, buckling under the strain like a shield struck by too many blows. Or the currents of the warp might shift unexpectedly, carrying the ship into regions where the boundary between dimensions is particularly thin, where maintaining a bubble of real space requires more power than the generators can provide. In the most sinister cases, Geller field failure is not an accident at all. Chaos cultists who have infiltrated the crew might sabotage the device deliberately, seeking to offer their fellow crew members as sacrifices to their dark gods. Or the field might be disrupted by psychic attack from the outside, demons in the warp focusing their malevolent will upon the ship, probing for weaknesses in its defenses, battering at the Geller field with psychic force until it finally gives way. There are even reports of devices designed specifically to disrupt Geller fields, weapons used by Chaos Space Marines to doom Imperial vessels, though whether such technology truly exists or is merely the fevered imagination of those driven mad by warp exposure remains unclear. Regardless of the cause, the effect is always the same. The Geller field fails, and the warp rushes in. In that first instant, before the crew can even fully comprehend what has happened, the ship ceases to be a human vessel and becomes something else, something that exists half in real space and half in the Immerterium, a hybrid thing that belongs fully to neither dimension. But Geller field failure is not the only way to become trapped. Space hulks, those massive conglomerations of wrecked and fused ships that drift through both the warp and real space seemingly at random, are another common source of warp entrapment. These hulks form when multiple damaged vessels, their warp drives malfunctioning, collide and merge within the Immerterium. The psychic energies of the warp bind the ships together, fusing metal to metal and flesh to metal in impossible configurations.
You know, I've been diving into Warhammer lore for years now, and I have to say, the warp is what really sets this universe apart from other sci-fi settings. Most franchises treat faster than light travel as just a convenient plot device, right? You press a button, boom, you're across the galaxy. But Games Workshop said, what if every journey through space was literally a trip through hell. And that commitment to making everything as grimdark as possible is exactly why I fell in love with this setting. The warp isn't just dangerous, it's a constant reminder that in the 41st millennium, even the tools humanity needs to survive are trying to destroy them. That's the genius of 40k. There's no easy solutions, no safe options. Every choice is just picking which nightmare you're willing to face. And honestly, that's what keeps me coming back. Anyways, let's get back to the story.
The resulting structures can be enormous, kilometers across, containing the remnants of dozens or even hundreds of individual vessels. Space hulks drift in and out of the warp without apparent rhyme or reason. A hulk might spend centuries in the Imperium, its structure slowly corrupted by exposure to chaos energies, before suddenly translating back into real space. It might remain in real space for months or years before vanishing back into the warp. This unpredictable movement makes space hulks both incredibly dangerous and potentially valuable. Dangerous because they can appear without warning near inhabited worlds, carrying with them any number of threats ranging from genestealer infestations to chaos cults to orc invaders who have been using the Hulk as a makeshift transport. Valuable because they often contain ancient technology, relics from the dark age of technology or earlier periods of human history, items of immense worth to the Adeptus Mechanicus and other imperial institutions. Those who board space hulks do so at tremendous risk. Even when a hulk is in real space, it carries with it the taint of warp exposure. The corridors and chambers are twisted, their layouts defying logic, with passages that loop back upon themselves or stairs that lead in physically impossible directions. The very structure of the Hulk seems to resist mapping, with different exploration teams sometimes reporting entirely different layouts in the same sections. And within these twisted passages lurk things that should not exist, creatures and entities that boarded the Hulk during its time in the warp and now wait in the darkness for new prey. Worse still is the knowledge that at any moment, without warning, the Space Hulk might translate back into the warp. Any boarding parties still aboard when this happens would find themselves trapped, pulled into the Imperium, along with the Hulk itself. Without a functional Geller field to protect them, without even the minimal shielding provided by an intact ship, they would be completely exposed to the warp's influence. The survival time for humans in such circumstances can be measured in minutes at best. Some ships become trapped in the warp not through accident, but through the deliberate action of warp storms. These massive disturbances in the Imperium can last for days, months, years, or even centuries, and they represent the warp at its most violently chaotic. Within a warp storm, the already unstable nature of the Imperium becomes even more pronounced. The psychic winds blow with hurricane force, tearing at ships and souls with equal fury. The currents become whirlpools that can trap a vessel and hold it spinning in place, unable to break free, unable to find the calm waters needed to translate back to real space. Warp storms can appear without warning, forming in response to particularly intense emotional events in real space. A major battle involving millions of combatants can spawn a warp storm as the psychic residue of all that death and violence pours into the Imperium. The fall of a hive world to chaos might create a permanent storm, a festering wound in reality that never fully heals. The birth of a chaos god, as happened when Slanesh came into being during the fall of the Eldar, can create storms that encompass vast swathes of the galaxy, rendering entire sectors unreachable for millennia. Ships caught in warp storms have little hope of escape. The violence of the storm makes navigation impossible. Navigators attempting to guide their vessels through such conditions often find themselves overwhelmed, their psychic sight seared by the intensity of the energies swirling around them. Some go mad from the experience, their minds broken by exposure to chaos beyond anything they were trained to endure. Others die, their brains literally burning out from psychic overload. And without a navigator to guide them, ships become truly lost, drifting through the storm with no way to orient themselves, no way to find the currents that might carry them back to real space. Then there are those who enter the warp deliberately, without the protection of a Geller field, seeking the power that chaos offers. These are the cultists and the damned, humans who have traded their souls for promises of glory or revenge, or simply the dark pleasures that the chaos gods offer to their servants. Some of these individuals are psychers who have been corrupted, their psychic gifts making them particularly vulnerable to the whispers of chaos. Others are simply desperate, driven to such extremes by the grinding misery of life in the Imperium that damnation seems preferable to their current existence. These willing victims often enter the warp through warp rifts, tears in reality where the boundary between dimensions has worn thin or been deliberately breached. The Eye of Terror, that vast scar in space where reality and the warp have become permanently intermingled, is the most famous of these rifts, but it is far from the only one. Smaller rifts appear and disappear throughout the galaxy, sometimes lasting only moments, sometimes enduring for centuries. Through these rifts, the influence of chaos can seep into real space, and through these rifts, those seeking to embrace damnation can pass into the warp. What these willing victims fail to understand, until it is far too late, is that the warp does not grant power without exacting a terrible price. The promises made by daemons are never lies, exactly, but they are always twisted, always corrupted in some way that turns victory into horror. A cultist might be granted the strength to defeat his enemies, only to find that strength comes at the cost of his humanity, transforming him into a hulking monstrosity that can barely remember who he once was. Another might be given knowledge of forbidden sorceries, only to discover that each spell cast tears away a piece of his soul, feeding it to the chaos gods that granted the power in the first place. Finally, there are those rare individuals who become trapped in the warp through sheer cosmic bad luck, victims of circumstances beyond anyone's control or prediction. A navigator might miscalculate a jump, emerging not in real space, but in a region of the warp where the currents are so twisted that escape becomes impossible. A ship might suffer damage to its warp drive at exactly the wrong moment, stranding it in the Imperium with no way to translate back to reality. Or a vessel might simply wander into a section of the warp that has become permanently unstable, a dead zone where the normal rules of warp travel no longer apply. In all these cases, regardless of how one becomes trapped, the result is the same. The victim finds themselves in a hostile dimension, surrounded by entities that hunger for their soul, with time becoming meaningless and reality itself turning against them. And once trapped, escape becomes a matter not just of survival, but of maintaining one's sanity and humanity in the face of horrors that would break the strongest mind. The dissolution of reality. The first thing that happens when someone becomes trapped in the warp after the initial shock of Geller field failure or sudden displacement is the dissolution of everything they understand about how reality works. This is not a metaphorical dissolution, not simply a matter of being confused or disoriented. The physical laws that govern the material universe literally cease to apply. Gravity becomes optional, matter stops being solid. Causality, that fundamental principle that effects follow causes in a predictable sequence, breaks down completely. The ship itself begins to change almost immediately. Metal that has been forged into precise shapes, that has maintained those shapes for decades or centuries, starts to warp and twist. Bulkheads bend inward or bulge outward without any apparent force being applied to them. The angles where walls meet floors and ceilings stop being right angles, becoming acute or obtuse in ways that hurt to look at, that create the impression of spaces that are simultaneously too large and too small. Corridors that the crew has walked thousands of times suddenly feel wrong, their proportions subtly off in ways that cannot quite be articulated, but which trigger deep primal discomfort. The colors begin to shift. Paint that was standard imperial grey starts to take on other hues, bleeding through with reds and purples and colors that don't exist in the standard spectrum of visible light. Some describe these impossible colors as looking like sound, or smelling like emotion, synesthetic experiences where the boundaries between different senses break down. Looking at these colors for too long can cause physical pain. headaches that throb in time with one's heartbeat, or nausea that seems to come not from the stomach, but from someplace deeper, from the very soul itself. The air becomes thick, taking on a texture like syrup or oil. Breathing requires conscious effort, each breath an act of will rather than the automatic process it should be. Some crew members report feeling as though they are drowning even while their lungs are filled with air, the sensation of suffocation persisting despite clearly being able to breathe. Others describe the air as having weight, as pressing down on them with physical force, growing heavier with each passing moment until they are crushed flat against whatever surface they're standing on. Temperature ceases to be a constant. One corridor might be blazing hot, the air shimmering with heat despite there being no obvious source of thermal energy. The next corridor over could be freezing cold, frost forming on every surface, even though the ship's environmental systems show normal operation in both areas. Sometimes the temperature fluctuates wildly within a single space, alternating between extremes so rapidly that crew members suffer from both heat stroke and hypothermia simultaneously. The ship's systems begin to malfunction, but not in ways that mechanical failure would explain. Lights flicker and change color, or remain steady while somehow managing to cast shadows in impossible directions. Multiple shadows from a single light source, shadows that move independently of the objects casting them, shadows that seem to have depth and substance, reaching out with shadowy fingers toward crew members who pass too close. The artificial gravity fails in some sections, but intensifies in others, creating regions where walking becomes impossible, where crew members are pinned to the deck or the ceiling by forces many times standard gravity. Electronics behave erratically. Computer screens display impossible information, readings that make no physical sense, numbers that change even as they're being observed, text that rewrites itself into languages that never existed. Communication systems pick up voices, but these voices speak from nowhere, belong to no one aboard the ship, or worse, belong to crew members who are standing right there but who aren't saying anything, their lips motionless while their voices echo through the comms. The ship begins to sprout growths, organic material that seeps from the joints between metal plates, that oozes from ventilation shafts, that blooms like fungus in the darker corners of corridors. This organic matter pulses with a rhythm that might be a heartbeat, might be breathing, might be some other biological function that has no name. Some describe it as looking like flesh, others as resembling plant matter, still others as something that seems to be both and neither, a form of life that exists only because the warp allows it to exist. These growths spread rapidly, covering walls and floors and ceilings with a living carpet that recoils from touch but cannot be removed. Attempts to cut away the growths result in them regenerating almost instantly, the organic material flowing back like liquid to fill the space that was cleared. Some crew members report that the growths seem to be aware, that they watch with invisible eyes, that they react to the presence of humans with something that might be curiosity or might be hunger. Objects begin to appear that weren't there before. Personal items belonging to crew members, long dead, manifest in places they shouldn't be. Photographs and trinkets and mementos that had been lost or destroyed suddenly reappearing as if they had always been there. Sometimes these items are changed, corrupted in subtle ways. A picture of a loved one might show that person with their eyes scratched out, or with an expression of terror frozen on their face. A cherished keepsake might be broken and repaired with some other substance, fragments held together by what looks like dried blood or crystallized screams. More disturbingly, objects that no one recognizes start to appear. Strange devices of unknown function, constructed from materials that shouldn't exist, that seem to serve no purpose, but which radiate a sense of wrongness. Books written in languages that hurt to read, their pages filled with words that move and change as they're observed. Weapons that look functional, but which no one dares to touch, sensing instinctively that picking up such a thing would result in corruption or possession. The architecture of the ship begins to change in more dramatic ways. New corridors appear where there were none before, passages that lead to sections of the ship that don't exist on any deck plan. Doors open onto rooms that are too large to fit in the space available, chambers that extend far beyond where the outer hull should be. Some crew members report finding entire decks that weren't part of the original ship design, levels inserted somehow between the existing floors, accessible by stairs that materialized overnight. These impossible spaces don't follow Euclidean geometry. A corridor might curve back on itself without ever changing direction, creating a loop that returns to its starting point, despite the traveler having walked in a straight line the entire time. Rooms might have more corners than their shape should allow, angles that add up to more than 360 degrees, or less than it. Distances become variable, with the same passage taking different amounts of time to traverse depending on who's walking it, or which direction they're walking, or for no discernible reason at all. Crew members begin to get lost in ships they've served on for years. Familiar routes no longer lead where they should. The way to the bridge or the engine room or the living quarters becomes a maze, with every turn leading to unfamiliar territory. Some crew members wander for hours trying to find their way back to their posts, only to realize they've been walking in circles, or worse, that they've somehow descended 20 decks when they were trying to go up 2. Time itself starts to behave strangely on a local level. Not the large-scale time dilation that affects warp travel as a whole, but smaller inconsistencies that make daily life nightmarish. A crew member might leave their quarters and arrive at their destination to find that hours have passed when they were only walking for minutes. Or they might spend what feels like an entire shift at their post, only to discover that only moments have elapsed in the external timeline. Different sections of the ship seem to exist at different rates of temporal flow, creating situations where one crew member has aged days while their companion, who never left their side, has aged only hours. Objects begin to age at different rates. Fresh food rots in minutes, becoming inedible mold-covered waste. Or conversely, food that should have spoiled weeks ago remains perfectly fresh, as if time has simply stopped flowing for those particular items. Metal corrodes and rusts in accelerated time, centuries of decay happening in hours, until support beams crumble and deck plates develop holes. Other sections of the ship seem untouched by time, remaining pristine and new-looking, even as everything around them decays. The boundaries between solid and liquid, between matter and energy, begin to blur. Water runs upward, defying gravity without apparent cause. Fire burns cold, giving off darkness instead of light. Air becomes thick enough to touch, to push aside like curtains. Solid metal becomes soft and pliable, rippling like fabric in a breeze. Some crew members report walls that they can push their hands through, the metal offering no more resistance than water, only to have the walls solidify again instantly, trapping their limbs inside solid steel. Physical injuries stop following normal patterns. Cuts don't bleed, or they bleed substances that aren't blood. Fluids that shouldn't exist inside a human body. Broken bones heal instantly, or they heal wrong, bones knitting together at impossible angles. Pain becomes disconnected from injury, with crew members feeling agony from wounds they don't have while actual injuries cause no sensation at all. This dissolution of physical reality is, in many ways, just the beginning. It represents the foundation upon which the true horror builds, the initial stage of transformation from a reality that makes sense into one that follows rules written by mad gods. For those trapped in the warp, watching their ship transform around them, seeing the laws of physics break down one by one, the psychological impact is devastating. The human mind relies on the predictability of the physical world. When that predictability vanishes, when every certainty becomes uncertain, sanity itself becomes just another casualty of warp exposure. Time becomes meaningless. Of all the horrors that await those trapped in the warp, perhaps none is more insidious than what happens to time. In the material universe, time is the one constant that can always be relied upon. It flows in one direction, from past to future, at a steady rate that never varies. Seconds tick into minutes, minutes into hours, hours into days, with perfect consistency. This constancy allows humans to plan, to remember, to maintain a coherent sense of self that extends from birth through life to death. But in the warp, time is not constant. It is not even consistent. Time becomes just another variable, subject to the chaotic whims of the Imperium, twisting and bending and looping back on itself in ways that shatter the human experience of existence. The relationship between time in the warp and time in real space has never been stable or predictable. A ship might spend what its crew experiences as a few hours in the Imperium, traveling from one star system to another, and emerge to find that days or weeks have passed in real space. This is the normal, acceptable level of temporal displacement that navigators learn to account for in their calculations, the expected discrepancy that every warp journey involves. But when a ship becomes trapped, when it loses the ability to return to real space on schedule, these small discrepancies can balloon into something far worse. Consider the case of a ship trapped in the warp for what feels to the crew like a week. They endure 7 days of horrors, fighting against demon incursions, struggling to maintain their sanity, watching their vessel slowly corrupt around them. Then, by some miracle, they manage to repair their warp drive or their Geller field or whatever was keeping them trapped. They translate back to real space, desperate to report their ordeal and receive help. But when they make contact with Imperial authorities, they discover that not 7 days, but 7 centuries have passed. Everyone they knew is long dead. The Imperium they served might have changed beyond recognition. Their chapter or regiment or ship class might have been declared extinct decades ago. They are ghosts, survivors from a time that no longer exists, and the psychological impact of this discovery can be as devastating as anything they experienced in the warp itself. The reverse situation is equally traumatic. A ship becomes trapped, and the crew suffers through what feels like months of horror. Every day is a battle for survival. Every hour brings new nightmares. Every minute seems to stretch into eternity. The crew ages under the stress, accumulating not just psychological trauma, but physical wear from their extended ordeal. Finally, they escape back to real space, only to discover that in the material universe, only hours have passed since they entered the warp. From the perspective of Imperial Command, they've barely been gone. But the crew carries months of memories, months of aging, months of trauma compressed into a handful of hours of external time. More disturbing still are the cases where ships emerge from the warp before they entered it. The temporal fluidity of the Imperium means that the arrow of time can point in any direction, or in multiple directions simultaneously, or in no direction at all. A vessel might enter the warp in the year 41,999 and emerge in the year 41,998, arriving at its destination a full year before it departed its origin point. From the crew's perspective, time has flowed normally. They experience the journey in the expected sequence, entering the warp and then later exiting it. But from an external frame of reference, they have traveled backward through time. These backward jumps create paradoxes that the Imperium has learned not to think about too carefully. What happens if the ship's past self encounters its future self? What if information gained during the journey is used to prevent the journey from happening? The official doctrine of the Adeptus Mechanicus is that such questions are meaningless, that the warp operates beyond the normal constraints of causality and trying to understand it using real space logic is futile. But for those who experience these temporal loops firsthand, the philosophical questions are overshadowed by the sheer existential horror of discovering that you have somehow preceded yourself. Within the warp itself, time becomes even more problematic. Different parts of the ship can exist at different points in time simultaneously. A crew member might leave the engine room, where time is flowing at something approaching a normal rate, and walk to the bridge, where time has slowed to a crawl. From the perspective of the crew member, the journey takes a few minutes, but when they arrive at the bridge, they discover that the crew there has been waiting for them for hours or days, watching the doorway through which the crew member was going to emerge, seeing them approach in extremely slow motion. Or the opposite might occur. Time on the bridge might be flowing rapidly compared to the rest of the ship. The crew member walks from the engine room to the bridge in what feels like a few minutes, but when they arrive, they find the bridge crew ancient, having lived through years while the journey took place. Or they might find the bridge empty, the crew having died of old age, and their bodies long since decayed to dust. The passage of centuries compressed into the subjective experience of minutes. Some sections of trapped ships seem to exist in temporal loops, where events repeat endlessly. A crew member enters a room and witnesses a scene, perhaps a conversation between other crew members or a particular sequence of actions. They leave the room and return later, only to witness the exact same scene playing out again, word for word, action for action. The people involved might not remember the previous iterations, experiencing each loop as if it were the first time. Or they might remember, trapped in a nightmare of repetition, doomed to speak the same words and perform the same actions over and over, unable to break the cycle. More horrifying are the temporal fragments, moments ripped from the normal flow of time and preserved like insects in amber. A crew member might round a corner and suddenly see their own death, a frozen moment pulled from their personal future, showing them exactly how they will die. Or they might witness their own birth, seeing themselves as an infant in the arms of parents they've never known, a scene from a past they don't remember. These fragments can appear at random, interspersed with the ship's present timeline, creating a discontinuous experience of reality where past, present, and future all exist simultaneously. The psychological impact of these temporal distortions cannot be overstated. Human consciousness depends on the orderly progression of time to maintain coherence. Memories of the past inform understanding of the present and planning for the future. This temporal sequence is fundamental to how humans construct their sense of self, their identity as continuous beings that persist through time. But when time becomes discontinuous, when the sequence of events stops making sense, the foundation of consciousness itself begins to crack. Crew members trapped in ships where time has become unstable report experiences that defy description. They remember events that haven't happened yet. They forget things that are happening right now. They exist in multiple time periods simultaneously, aware of themselves at different ages, experiencing their entire lifespan compressed into a single eternal now. Some describe it as being stretched across time, their consciousness spread thin like butter over too much bread, each moment of their life existing simultaneously and separately. The sensation drives most mad within days, and those who somehow retain their sanity through such experiences are often fundamentally changed. Their conception of reality altered in ways that make it impossible for them to fully return to normal existence, even if they escape the warp. The worst cases involve what might be called temporal predation. Demons in the warp, particularly those aligned with Tzeentch, the chaos god of change and fate, can manipulate time as a weapon. They might steal moments from a person's life, leaving gaps in memory and experience that the victim can sense but not recover. Hours or days or years simply vanish, excised from the timeline as cleanly as if they never happened. Or they might add time, inserting false memories and experiences, making the victim believe they've lived through events that never occurred. Some trapped crew members age rapidly, their bodies fast-forwarding through decades of physical decline in the span of hours. Hair turns grey, then white, then falls out. Skin wrinkles and sags. Joints stiffen and bones become brittle. They die of old age while still young, their bodies unable to cope with the accelerated temporal flow. Others experience the opposite, growing younger, regressing from adulthood to adolescence to childhood to infancy, their bodies rewinding through their developmental stages while their minds remain adult, trapped in forms that become increasingly helpless. There are reports of crew members who exist simultaneously at multiple ages, their bodies flickering between different stages of life like a broken hologram. One moment they're young and strong, the next they're elderly and frail, the next they're children, cycling through their entire lifespan in the span of seconds. Some become temporally unstable in different parts of their bodies, with one arm aged and withered while the other remains young, or with their torso at one age and their head at another. The concept of duration becomes meaningless. How long have you been trapped? The question has no answer because time has ceased to flow in any consistent direction. You might say a week, but was it a week experienced normally, or a week that felt like a day, or a week that felt like a year? Different crew members, standing in the same room, experiencing the same events, will give wildly different estimates of how much time has passed, and none of them are wrong because time itself has become subjective. Navigation through time becomes as important as navigation through space. Navigators trained to guide ships through the spatial currents of the warp find themselves having to also navigate temporal currents, seeking paths that will return the ship not just to the correct location in space, but also to the correct moment in time. Some paths through the warp lead to the past, others to the future, still others to moments that exist outside the normal timeline entirely. Choosing the wrong path could strand a ship years or centuries away from when they need to be. For those trapped in such circumstances, the experience of time becomes a weapon used against them by the warp itself. They cannot rely on their memories because their memories might be from events that haven't happened yet or might not happen at all. They cannot plan for the future because the future might arrive before the present or might have already passed. They cannot even trust their own aging bodies because those bodies might be showing the accumulated years of a lifetime they haven't lived or might be frozen at an age they should have long since passed. Time, that most fundamental measure of existence, becomes just another tool in the warp's arsenal of torments. The psychological horror, physical transformation, temporal distortion, and environmental impossibility are all terrible in their own right. But perhaps nothing about being trapped in the warp is more devastating than what it does to the mind. The human psyche evolved to process information from a stable, predictable reality where cause follows effect, where past leads to present, leads to future, where the physical world behaves according to consistent rules. The warp violates every one of these expectations. It is a dimension where thought becomes reality, where emotions manifest as physical forces, where the boundary between internal mental experience and external objective reality breaks down completely. And when the mind is exposed to such an environment without the protection of a Geller field or the mental disciplines of a trained psyker, it begins to come apart. The first symptom is usually the hallucinations. At first, they're subtle, easily dismissed as tricks of the eye or stress-induced misperceptions, a shadow that moves when it shouldn't, a voice heard from an empty corridor, a face glimpsed in the corner of vision that vanishes when looked at directly. Crew members might report these experiences to their fellows, comparing notes, trying to determine if what they're seeing is real or imagined. But as time passes, as exposure to the warp continues, the hallucinations become more vivid, more persistent, harder to distinguish from reality. These are not random visions. The warp does not generate arbitrary imagery. It responds to the thoughts and emotions of those within it, drawing on their memories and fears to create hallucinations specifically tailored to cause maximum psychological damage. A crew member who lost a child years ago might see that child walking the corridors of the ship, appearing exactly as they did on the day they died. The child speaks, calling out to their parent, begging to be saved, accusing them of failures both real and imagined. The parent knows intellectually that this is impossible, that their child is dead and gone. But the vision is so perfect, so convincing, that doubt creeps in. What if it's real? What if somehow the child has returned? What if the warp has given them a second chance? This is the cruelty of warp-induced hallucinations. They are not obviously false. They exploit vulnerabilities, playing on hopes and guilts and fears in ways that make them seem plausible, even when logic says otherwise. A crew member with survivor's guilt might see their fallen comrades, walking corpses that ask why they were left behind, why their sacrifice meant nothing. Someone who has harbored secret resentments might see the targets of that resentment getting their revenge, attacking with justifications that echo the hallucinator's own internal criticisms. The hallucinations feed on attention. The more someone thinks about them, the more real they become. This creates a vicious cycle where attempting to analyze whether a vision is real or false actually makes it more powerful, more convincing. The warp responds to the mental focus by reinforcing the vision, adding details, making it more substantial. Eventually, the hallucination becomes indistinguishable from reality, or rather, it becomes reality, because in the warp, belief and actuality are one and the same. Beyond the hallucinations come the whispers. Voices speak from nowhere, sometimes audible to everyone, sometimes heard only by specific individuals. They claim to be offering help, guidance, a way out of the nightmare. They speak with the voices of trusted friends or loved ones, using intimate knowledge of the listener's life to build credibility. They understand your pain, they say. They know what you're going through. They can help if you'll just do this one small thing, make this one tiny compromise. These whispers are, of course, demons. They are the servants of the chaos gods, entities of malevolent intelligence that seek to corrupt and ultimately consume mortal souls. But they are patient. They do not demand immediate allegiance or sudden dark pacts. Instead, they work gradually, eroding resistance bit by bit, normalizing the abnormal, making corruption seem like salvation. The first requests are always reasonable. Just perform this small ritual. It will strengthen the ship's defenses. Just speak these words. They're a prayer for protection. Just make this mark on the wall. It will ward off the other entities. Each small compliance makes the next step easier. The human mind seeks consistency, wants to avoid cognitive dissonance. If you've already done one thing at the whisper's suggestion, if that action didn't immediately result in catastrophe, then maybe the next suggestion is also acceptable. The corruption proceeds by degrees, so gradually that the victim might not notice they're changing until it's far too late. By the time they realize they've been marking their skin with chaos symbols or chanting prayers to dark gods, they're already too far gone to turn back. The isolation compounds the psychological damage. Ships trapped in the warp are cut off from all outside contact. The Astronomicon, that great psychic lighthouse that guides Imperial vessels, cannot penetrate deep into the Imperium. Communication with other ships or planetary bases becomes impossible. The crew is alone in the most complete sense of the word, trapped in a small metal box surrounded by infinity of hostile chaos, with no hope of rescue and no knowledge of whether anyone even knows they're in trouble. Human beings are social creatures. They need connection, interaction, the sense of belonging to a larger community. Extended isolation, even in normal circumstances, can lead to mental instability, depression, psychosis. But isolation in the warp is far worse than normal isolation, because the alternative to human contact is not emptiness, but the malevolent attention of demons. The crew can either cling to each other, trusting in relationships that might already be strained by the stress of their situation, or they can accept the company offered by the entities that whisper from the darkness. Many choose the latter, not because they want to serve chaos, but because the psychological need for connection overwhelms their judgment. The demons are always there, always ready to talk, always seeming to understand. They offer the simulation of companionship, and for minds under extreme stress, simulation becomes sufficient. It's a trap, of course. The demons are not offering genuine friendship, but rather grooming their victims for eventual possession or corruption. But by the time the victim realizes this, they're already too dependent on the false relationship to break free. The stress of the situation breaks down normal social cohesion within the crew. Small disagreements become bitter feuds. Personality conflicts that might have been minor annoyances in normal circumstances escalate into violent hatred. Trust erodes as paranoia grows. Every crew member begins to suspect their fellows of being corrupted, of being agents of chaos, of plotting betrayal. These suspicions are sometimes justified. Chaos does corrupt from within, does turn crew members into unwitting or willing servants. But the paranoia spreads faster than the actual corruption, destroying unity long before demons need to intervene directly. Violence breaks out, not from demon possession, but from pure human desperation and madness. Crew members turn on each other, seeing enemies where there are only frightened fellow victims. Murder becomes common. Some kills are rational, or at least understandable, putting down crew members who have clearly been corrupted or driven insane. But many are not rational at all, born from panic or rage, or the simple need to exert control over something in an environment where control is impossible. Sleep becomes a new source of horror. In the material universe, sleep is a refuge, a necessary rest, where the mind can process the experiences of the day and the body can recover. But in the warp, sleep offers no refuge. Dreams become more vivid, more real, indistinguishable from waking experience. Worse, dreams become shared, with multiple crew members experiencing the same nightmares simultaneously, meeting in dreamscapes that seem to exist independently of any individual mind. These shared dreams are, of course, crafted by demons, who find that sleeping minds offer even less resistance than waking ones. In dreams, the defenses that keep us sane when awake break down. The critical faculty that says, "This is impossible, therefore it's not real," simply doesn't function during sleep. We accept the impossible as routine when dreaming, and demons exploit this vulnerability ruthlessly, using dreams to plant suggestions, to corrupt values, to gradually reshape the sleeper's psyche according to chaos designs. Some crew members stop sleeping entirely, recognizing the danger that sleep represents. But this is merely trading one form of mental degradation for another. Sleep deprivation brings its own madness. Hallucinations become worse, not better, without sleep. Decision-making deteriorates. Emotional control breaks down. The body begins to shut down, organs failing from the sustained stress. After a certain point, usually around a week without sleep, the mind begins to die, neurons firing randomly, consciousness fragmenting into something that is barely recognizable as human thought. Memory begins to fail, but not in the normal way that memory fails. Crew members find themselves unable to remember events from before they entered the warp, their past lives fading like dreams upon waking. Names and faces blur and slip away. Important personal details, things that should be fundamental to identity, become uncertain. Did I have a family? Where was I born? What was my purpose before all this? The questions have no clear answers, or the answers keep changing, memory rewriting itself, the past becoming as fluid and uncertain as the present. At the same time, false memories appear, experiences that never happened, inserting themselves into personal history. A crew member might suddenly recall a conversation that never occurred, or remember serving on a different ship, or have clear memories of a childhood that isn't theirs. These false memories are often more vivid than genuine ones, more detailed, more emotionally resonant. And because memory is fundamental to identity, these changes in memory represent changes in self. The person who emerges from the warp, if they emerge at all, might not be the same person who entered, not because their body has changed, but because their past has been rewritten. The sense of self begins to dissolve under this assault. Who am I? The question becomes genuinely difficult to answer. If my memories are unreliable, if my body is changing in ways I don't understand, if time itself has become meaningless, then what exactly is the I that persists through all these changes? Some crew members experience depersonalization, feeling as though they are watching themselves from outside their bodies, observing their actions as if they belong to someone else. Others experience derealization, becoming convinced that nothing around them is real, that their entire experience is a dream or a simulation. These are defensive reactions, ways the mind tries to protect itself from overwhelming horror by creating distance between experience and self. But they are also steps toward complete mental breakdown. A person who doesn't believe they're real, who has lost the sense of existing as a coherent entity, is much more vulnerable to possession or corruption. They've already begun the process of dissolution, making it easier for demons to replace what remains with something else entirely. Some crew members develop dissociative identity disorder, their personalities fracturing into multiple distinct persons as a way of compartmentalizing trauma. Different identities emerge to handle different aspects of their nightmare existence. One identity might deal with day-to-day survival, another with combat situations, another with the emotional processing of loss and horror. These identities might not even be aware of each other, periods of time going missing as different personas take control. And demons can work on these fractured identities separately, corrupting some while leaving others superficially intact, creating the terrible situation where a person serves chaos without their own knowledge, their corrupted identity acting when other identities are dormant. The final stage of psychological breakdown is what might be called ego death, the complete dissolution of individual identity. The barriers between self and other break down entirely. Crew members lose the ability to distinguish between their thoughts and the thoughts of others. The whispers of demons become indistinguishable from their own internal voice. They stop experiencing themselves as separate beings and instead feel absorbed into some larger entity, their consciousness merging with the warp itself. This is, in effect, what happens to souls consumed by chaos, the final obliteration of individual existence, the transformation from person to raw psychic energy that feeds the eternal hunger of the dark gods. Demon encounters and possession, while the environmental and psychological horrors of the warp are terrible in themselves, they pale in comparison to what happens when crew members encounter the Imperium's true inhabitants, the demons. These entities are not merely predatory animals or mindless forces. They are intelligences, ancient and malevolent, formed from the collective emotional energy of sentient beings across millions of years. Each demon embodies specific aspects of emotion and desire, crystallized into a form that can think and plan and act with purpose. And they are always hungry, eternally seeking to consume mortal souls or to corrupt mortal bodies into vessels for their own manifestation in real space. Demons cannot enter the material universe easily. The barrier between the warp and real space normally keeps them confined to the Imperium. But when a ship's Geller field fails, when that barrier breaks down, the demons pour through like water through a shattered dam. They manifest aboard the ship in forms that mortal eyes were never meant to see, shapes that violate the laws of physics and biology, beings that exist partially in real space and partially still in the warp. The demons of Khorne, the blood god, are perhaps the most straightforward in their horror. They appear as warriors, towering figures clad in brass armor, their bodies ridged with muscle that seems more like carved metal than flesh. They carry great axes and swords, weapons forged in the foundries of their god's realm, eternally sharp and hungering for blood. These demons do not whisper or manipulate. They simply attack, driven by an unquenchable need for violence and slaughter. A Khornate demon boarding a ship with a failed Geller field is death incarnate. It moves through corridors, leaving trails of gore, cutting down crew members with mechanical efficiency. These demons feel no mercy, no compassion, no emotion beyond the joy of killing. They are the embodiment of rage given form, and that rage cannot be reasoned with or placated. The only defense is to fight back, but fighting demons with conventional weapons is often futile. They are creatures of the warp, not truly physical beings, and killing the material form they manifest merely banishes them temporarily back to the Imperium. The lesser demons of Khorne, called bloodletters, operate in packs, hunting crew members through the ship with predatory intelligence. They can smell fear and weakness, targeting those who are isolated or wounded. Their presence fills the air with the stench of spilled blood, and their war cries echo through the corridors like the screaming of tortured souls. Where they walk, the deck plates crack and metal warps from the sheer intensity of the violent energies they carry with them. More terrible still are the greater demons of Khorne, the bloodthirsters, towering monsters that stand as tall as a building, with wings of brass and shadow that allow them to move with impossible speed despite their massive size. These beings are generals of Khorne's armies, and their intelligence matches their physical might. A bloodthirster manifesting aboard a trapped ship is a catastrophe beyond imagining. It tears through bulkheads like paper, fills entire decks with its presence, and nothing aboard can stand against it, except perhaps a Space Marine librarian or an extremely powerful psyker. And even they might only buy time, not victory. The demons of Nurgle, the Plague Father, are different in character, but no less horrifying. Where Khornate demons are aggressive and violent, Nurgle's servants are patient and invasive. They manifest as rotting, bloated things, their bodies host to every disease and pestilence imaginable. They smell of decay and corruption, and their very presence spreads infection. Crew members who breathe the same air as a Nurgle daemon begin to sicken immediately, their bodies betraying them from within as plagues take hold. These daemons, called plague bearers, shamble through ships on legs swollen with infection, their bodies leaking pus and other fluids. They speak in cheerful tones, as if they're greeting old friends, and they describe the blessings that Nurgle offers to those who accept his embrace. They explain that pain and fear come from resisting the inevitable decay of all things, and that accepting death and disease brings a kind of peace. It's a seductive message to those suffering in the nightmare of warp exposure, and many accept Nurgle's gifts willingly, trading corruption for the cessation of fear. The infections Nurgle's demons spread are not normal diseases. They are supernatural plagues that mutate flesh in impossible ways. Crew members develop growths of fungal matter erupting from their skin, or their bodies swell with gases that make them balloon into grotesque parodies of human shape. The diseases are often not immediately fatal. Instead, they transform, corrupting the victim's body slowly, turning them into something that is still technically alive, but utterly changed. In time, the infected become plague bearers themselves, their souls claimed by Nurgle, their bodies now serving as vessels for the Plague Father's will. Greater demons of Nurgle, called Great Unclean Ones, are even more horrible. These massive beings appear as enormous, obese figures, whose bodies are host to entire ecosystems of disease. They move with surprising gentleness, treating their mortal victims almost with affection, as if they're nurturing children, rather than spreading corruption. They laugh constantly, finding joy in decay, and they offer blessings freely to all who will accept them. A ship infected by a Great Unclean One's presence becomes a mobile plague vector, carrying diseases that can contaminate entire worlds if the vessel ever makes it back to real space. The demons of Tzeentch, the Changer of Ways, are the most insidious and perhaps the most terrifying because they target the mind rather than the body. They manifest as creatures of shifting form and impossible geometry, beings that seem to exist in more dimensions than three, whose shapes constantly mutate and evolve. Looking directly at a Tzeentchian demon can cause madness as the mind tries and fails to process visual information that violates every rule of physical reality. These demons, called horrors, manipulate reality around them, reshaping the ship's structure with casual gestures, turning metal into flesh or flesh into crystal. They whisper secrets, forbidden knowledge that corrupts the mind through understanding. They offer power to those desperate enough to accept it, and that power is real, granting psychic abilities or knowledge of sorceries. But the price is always steep, and the bargains made with Tzeentchian demons always include hidden clauses that ensure the ultimate corruption or destruction of the mortal who made the deal. The greater demons of Tzeentch, the Lords of Change, are sorcerers of immense power. They can see the future, or rather, they can see multiple possible futures branching out from every moment, and they manipulate events to guide reality down the paths that serve their masters' inscrutable purposes. A Lord of Change manifesting aboard a trapped ship might not attack at all. Instead, it might simply observe, speaking cryptic prophecies, planting ideas and suggestions that will eventually lead to the ship's doom, but which seem like good ideas at the time. By the time the crew realizes they've been manipulated, it's far too late, and the corruption is complete. Finally, there are the demons of Slaanesh, the Prince of Pleasure. These beings appear as impossibly beautiful or impossibly horrifying, often both simultaneously, forms that assault the senses with their perfection or their wrongness. They offer pleasure, sensation, the fulfillment of every desire. And in the hellish circumstances of a ship trapped in the warp, where every moment is fear and suffering, the promise of pleasure can be overwhelmingly seductive. Slaaneshi daemons, called demonettes, move with hypnotic grace, their voices like music, their touch simultaneously gentle and violent. They explain that all the suffering can end, that pleasure awaits those willing to embrace it. They twist desire into obsession, taking natural human wants and amplifying them until they become all-consuming needs. A crew member who accepts a Slaaneshi demon's offer finds that pleasure and pain merge into a single sensation, that satisfaction becomes impossible because desire keeps growing, that they're trapped in an eternal cycle of craving that can never be fulfilled. The greater demons of Slaanesh, the keepers of secrets, are beings of overwhelming presence. They combine aspects of beauty and horror in ways that the mind cannot fully process. To look upon a keeper of secrets is to experience every sensation at once, pleasure and pain and hunger and satisfaction, all merged into a single, overwhelming assault on consciousness. Many who encounter these beings simply go mad immediately, their minds shattering under the weight of sensation. Those who survive the initial encounter often become willing servants, addicted to the intensity of experience that only Slaanesh can provide. But worse than simply encountering demons is the process of demonic possession. This occurs when a demon doesn't simply attack a crew member, but actually invades their body, displacing or merging with their soul, using their physical form as a vessel for manifestation in real space. The process is agonizing, a violation that goes far beyond physical rape. It is the ultimate loss of autonomy, the self being pushed aside or absorbed by an alien intelligence that takes control of one's body. Possession often begins subtly. A demon might initially share control with the victim, speaking through their mouth occasionally, but not always, influencing their actions but not completely dominating them. This makes it difficult for others to recognize that possession has occurred. The victim seems mostly themselves, with only occasional strange outbursts or unusual behaviors. But over time, the demon gains more control, asserting itself more frequently, until eventually the original personality is completely suppressed or destroyed, and the demon has full command of the body. A possessed crew member becomes a weapon against their fellows. They have all the knowledge and memories of the original person, can imitate their behavior patterns perfectly, can pass security checks because they are using legitimate credentials. But inside, they're entirely controlled by a malevolent intelligence that seeks to spread corruption and destruction. They might sabotage critical systems, or murder key personnel, or perform rituals that weaken the ship's defenses further, all while appearing to be normal crew members going about their duties. The physical signs of possession vary. Sometimes there are none, with the demon perfectly maintaining the victim's appearance. Other times, the body begins to change, developing mutations or marks that indicate the influence of chaos. Eyes might glow with unnatural colors. Skin might develop lesions or growths. Strength and resilience might increase beyond human norms. The possessed might speak in voices not their own, or speak languages they never knew, or produce sounds that no human throat should be capable of making. Fighting possessed crew members is a nightmare because they're often friends or family of those who must stop them. The person you're trying to kill is not some alien enemy, but rather your comrade, someone you've served with for years, someone you care about. And there's always the question of whether they can be saved, whether the demon can be exorcised and the original personality restored. The answer is almost always no. Once possession is complete, the original soul is usually destroyed or so damaged that recovery is impossible. But the faint hope prevents decisive action, allowing possessed individuals to do tremendous damage before they're finally stopped. In the most extreme cases, possession leads to full demonic manifestation. The victim's body is completely consumed, transformed into a physical anchor for the daemon. The flesh warps and grows, expanding far beyond its original size, taking on characteristics of the daemon's true form. What was once a human becomes a hybrid creature, part mortal flesh and part warp stuff, a living gate through which the demon can exert its full power in real space. These demon hosts are nearly unstoppable, combining the demon's supernatural abilities with the tactical advantages of operating in a physical body. For those crew members who witness their fellows being possessed, who watch friends and loved ones transform into monsters, the psychological damage is incalculable. Trust evaporates completely. Anyone might be possessed. That person acting normally might have a demon hiding inside them, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Paranoia, already intense, becomes completely consuming. The crew turns on each other with violence, not out of corruption, but out of desperate self-preservation, killing anyone who shows even the slightest sign of unusual behavior. The fate of the flesh. While the mind suffers terribly from exposure to the warp, the body does not escape unscathed. Human flesh, like all physical matter, is subject to the laws of biology and physics in the material universe. But in the warp, those laws no longer apply. The human body becomes mutable, subject to change and transformation in ways that evolution never prepared for. DNA, that stable blueprint that defines our physical form, becomes just another suggestion, easily overwritten by the chaotic energies of the Imperium. And the transformations that result are not clean, not purposeful, but rather the random mutations of flesh exposed to forces it was never meant to encounter. The changes often begin small, easily missed or dismissed as stress-related symptoms. A crew member might notice their hair changing color, strands of grey or white appearing seemingly overnight. Or they might find their nails growing faster than normal, becoming thick and discolored. Skin develops rashes or lesions that don't heal properly or heal too quickly, the flesh knitting together in patterns that look wrong, raised and ridged rather than smooth. These early mutations are disturbing but not yet debilitating. The affected crew members can still function, can still perform their duties, though they might try to hide the changes, wrapping rashes in bandages or shaving heads to conceal hair color shifts. But as exposure to the warp continues, the mutations accelerate and intensify, spreading from cosmetic alterations to changes that fundamentally alter the structure and function of the body. Bones begin to grow in ways they shouldn't. Extra ribs appear, pushing out against the skin. The spine curves or lengthens, vertebrae multiplying beyond the normal count. Skulls reshape, foreheads bulging or receding, jaws extending. These changes are painful, the body screaming in protest as it's forced into configurations that violate its natural architecture. Crew members might feel their bones shifting beneath their skin, grinding against each other, breaking and reforming in real time. Muscles change density and distribution. Some crew members become incredibly strong, their musculature swelling until they can barely fit through doorways designed for normal human proportions. But this strength comes at a cost. The muscles require more energy than normal metabolism can provide, so the crew member must eat constantly or begin to literally consume themselves, the body cannibalizing its own tissues to fuel the enhanced musculature. Others experience the opposite, their muscles withering away, leaving them weak and frail, barely able to move under their own power. The skin itself begins to change in texture and composition. Some crew members develop scales, their skin hardening into overlapping plates like reptilian armor. Others find their skin becoming translucent, veins and organs visible beneath the surface, giving them a ghostly, ethereal appearance. Still others develop excessive hair growth, thick fur covering their bodies, or they lose all body hair entirely, becoming completely smooth and featureless. Eyes, those delicate organs that allow us to see, are particularly vulnerable to warp-induced mutation. Color changes are common, pupils shifting from black to red or gold or colors that don't exist in normal biology. Some crew members develop additional eyes, extra organs appearing on their foreheads or cheeks or the backs of their hands, all fully functional, but providing sensory input that the brain was never designed to process. The resulting confusion and disorientation can be as debilitating as blindness. More disturbing are the cases where eyes stop being eyes and become something else entirely. The organs might begin to glow, emitting light in various colors, turning the victim into a living beacon that attracts unwanted attention from demons. Or the eyes might become windows, literal portals through which the warp can be seen directly, the victim forced to witness the Imperium constantly, unable to close their eyes or look away from visions that drive them inexorably toward madness. Internal organs transform in ways that medical knowledge cannot explain. Hearts develop additional chambers, or begin beating in irregular patterns, or multiply so that the victim has 2 or 3 or more hearts, all pumping blood through a circulatory system that was designed for only one. Lungs change structure, developing gill-like structures that would allow breathing underwater or in vacuum, but which make breathing normal air difficult and painful. Digestive systems alter, allowing the consumption of substances that would normally be toxic or indigestible, but making normal food impossible to process. Some mutations are so extensive that the victim ceases to be recognizably human at all. They might develop additional limbs, arms sprouting from their torso in random locations, or their legs might fuse into a single appendage, forcing them to slither like serpents. Their heads might split, duplicating into 2 or more that share a single neck, each head sometimes possessing independent thought and personality. Or they might grow to enormous size, their bodies expanding until they can no longer fit through normal doorways, becoming trapped in whatever room they were in when the growth started. The mutations are not consistent between victims. Each person transforms in different ways, following no predictable pattern. This unpredictability is itself a source of horror. Crew members cannot prepare for what might happen to them because there's no way to know what form the mutations will take. They can only wait and watch as their bodies betray them, changing in ways that are always disturbing and often agonizing. Pain is a constant companion to these transformations. The human nervous system was designed to work with a specific body architecture, and when that architecture changes, pain receptors fire in constant distress. Every mutation comes with its own particular agony. Bones growing generate pain that makes the victim feel as if they're being torn apart from the inside. Skin changing texture burns like acid. Organs shifting position create nausea and cramping that can leave the victim curled into a fetal position, unable to move or think through the waves of suffering. Some mutations actively work against the victim's survival. A crew member might develop gills but lose the ability to breathe air, suffocating in the ship's atmosphere. Another might grow additional eyes that provide vision, but which are so sensitive to light that normal illumination levels cause blinding pain. Still another might develop enhanced strength, but bones that aren't strong enough to support the increased muscular force, resulting in fractures every time they move. The psychological impact of watching one's body transform is devastating in ways that parallel but differ from the other mental assaults of warp exposure. The body is fundamental to identity in ways that the mind doesn't always consciously acknowledge. We navigate the world through our bodies, experience reality through our senses, express ourselves through physical actions. When the body changes beyond recognition, when the form no longer matches the internal self-image, a profound disconnection occurs. Some victims develop severe body dysmorphia, unable to recognize their own reflections, convinced that the mutated thing they see in the mirror cannot possibly be them. They might refuse to look at themselves, covering every reflective surface, or conversely become obsessed with their transformations, constantly examining the changes, documenting each new mutation with a combination of horror and fascination. Identity becomes unstable when anchored to a form that won't stay constant. The social aspect compounds the trauma. Crew members who have mutated extensively often find themselves shunned by their fellows, treated with fear or disgust or pity. The natural human reaction to deformity and mutation is revulsion, an instinctive response that's difficult to overcome even when the mutated person is someone you've known for years. Friendships deteriorate. Families fracture. The mutated find themselves isolated not because they've changed internally, but because their external form has become too alien for others to comfortably interact with. This isolation can drive the mutated toward accepting further corruption. If they're already considered monsters by their fellows, why not become the monster completely? If their humanity is already denied, why cling to what remains? The demons whisper that the mutations are gifts, that the pain will end if they just surrender to the transformation, that true power lies in accepting what they're becoming rather than fighting against it. And indeed, some mutations do provide advantages, at least in the short term. Enhanced strength, regardless of its cost, is useful in combat situations. Additional limbs can allow manipulation of multiple tools simultaneously. Altered senses might provide warning of approaching demons or ability to navigate regions of the ship that would otherwise be inaccessible. But these advantages are always double-edged, purchased at the cost of humanity, and what begins as useful adaptation can quickly spiral into complete loss of self. The ultimate fate of most heavily mutated crew members is transformation into chaos spawn. These beings represent the end stage of uncontrolled mutation, creatures that have changed so completely that nothing remains of their original form or mind. Chaos spawn are gibbering masses of flesh and limbs and eyes, constantly shifting, constantly in pain, driven entirely by instinct with no trace of the person they once were. They attack anything that moves, friend or foe making no difference, because they have no capacity for recognition or reasoning. They are the warning of what awaits those who surrender to mutation, the final proof that the warp's gifts are curses in disguise. Space hulks, tombs of the damned. Among the many horrors that drift through the warp, few are as infamous or as dangerous as space hulks. These massive conglomerations of wrecked and fused vessels represent the ultimate fate of many ships trapped in the Imperium. They are floating tombs, monuments to failed journeys and doomed crews, structures that exist simultaneously in the warp and real space, drifting between dimensions seemingly at random, and within their twisted corridors and impossible chambers, lurk things that should not exist, creatures and entities that have made these hulks their home, waiting in the darkness for new prey. Space hulks form when multiple damaged ships collide within the warp. The normal rules of collision physics don't apply in the Imperium. Ships that impact each other don't simply bounce apart or crumple. Instead, the warp energies fuse them together, metal flowing into metal, creating connections that defy structural engineering, merging vessels into single structures that can span kilometers in every direction. These fusions are not clean. The ships remain identifiable, at least partially, their silhouettes still visible in the overall mass. But between them grow impossible structures, bridges of crystallized warp energy, towers of fused metal that spiral in non-Euclidean patterns, voids that should not exist within the bulk of the hulk, but which open into spaces far larger than the external dimensions would suggest possible. The internal layout of a space hulk is nightmare-made navigable architecture. Corridors from different ships connect in ways that make no sense. A passage from a military frigate suddenly opening into a cargo hold from a merchant vessel, even though the two ships were built thousands of years apart and should not even be in contact with each other. Gravity varies wildly, some sections maintaining their original artificial gravity, others having none at all, still others featuring gravitational fields that point in impossible directions or which shift without warning as explorers move through them. Time behaves strangely within space hulks, just as it does throughout the warp. Different sections of the hulk can exist at different temporal rates. An explorer might walk from a room where time flows normally into one where time has stopped entirely, the air itself frozen in place, dust motes hanging motionless, water droplets suspended mid-air. Or they might enter rooms where time flows backward, where damage repairs itself and corpses resurrect, only to die again in reversed sequence, caught in temporal loops that play out over and over. The inhabitants of space hulks are as varied as they are dangerous. Any creature or entity that can survive in the warp might find its way onto a hulk and make it home. Demons are the most common threat. Lesser entities that slip aboard when the hulk translates from the warp into real space, using the ship as a bridge to enter the material universe. These demons often establish territories within the hulk, claiming sections as their own, decorating them with symbols of their particular chaos god, creating shrines and altars where they can gather strength. Genestealers are another frequent inhabitant. These tyrannid infiltrator organisms are drawn to space hulks, using them as transport between worlds. They hide in the darkness, breeding in the forgotten sections, creating vast nests in the lower decks. Genestealer infestations can number in the thousands, entire hordes of these predators lurking in the shadows, waiting for boarding parties to venture too deep. Their presence makes every exploration of a hulk a deadly risk, because genestealers are incredibly effective ambush predators, and they can overwhelm even heavily armed parties through sheer numbers. Orcs also favor space hulks as a means of transportation. The greenskin tendency to travel via any available spacecraft, regardless of its condition, means that many hulks carry orc populations that have been living aboard for generations. These orcs establish crude societies within the hulk, fighting among themselves when no other enemy is available, building ramshackle structures from salvaged materials, creating weapons and tools from whatever they can scavenge. When the hulk translates into real space near a habitable world, the orcs pour out like a plague, launching invasions that can threaten entire systems. Human survivors sometimes live within space hulks, though calling them survivors is generous. These are crew members from the original ships, or descendants of those crew members, people who have spent decades or centuries trapped aboard the drifting mass. They are inevitably changed by their long exposure to the warp, mutated in body and corrupted in soul, becoming something that is no longer quite human. Some retain enough intelligence to be dangerous, setting traps for explorers or attacking from ambush with weapons salvaged from the various ships that make up the hulk. Others have devolved into feral creatures, barely more than animals, hunting by instinct in the darkness. Perhaps most dangerous are those humans who have willingly embraced chaos during their time aboard the Hulk. These cultists have made the Hulk into a dark temple, converting sections into shrines to the ruinous powers, performing rituals that call forth demons and spread corruption through the structure. They view the Hulk as a gift from their dark gods, a weapon that can be used to spread chaos wherever it emerges from the warp. They defend it fiercely, seeing any attempt to board or salvage the Hulk as an attack on their faith. The value of space hulks lies in the ancient technology they often contain. Ships that become part of hulks might be thousands of years old, dating back to the dark age of technology, when human engineering had reached heights that current civilization cannot match. The Adeptus Mechanicus will risk tremendous resources to explore space hulks because of the possibility of recovering STC fragments or other archaeotech, devices whose value is literally immeasurable. A single functioning STC could revolutionize Imperial technology, restoring manufacturing capabilities that have been lost for millennia. But the risks of Hulk exploration cannot be overstated. Boarding parties typically consist of space marines, specifically Terminators, warriors whose heavy armor and advanced weapons give them the best chance of surviving the horrors within. Even these elite forces suffer heavy casualties. The environment itself is hostile, with sections of the Hulk decompressed or toxic, with structural integrity compromised so that entire decks can collapse without warning, with radiation or other hazards that can kill even through power armor. The psychological toll on explorers is severe. Space hulks are dark, the lighting systems of the constituent ships either failing or warped by warp energies into providing only flickering, uncertain illumination. The darkness presses in, thick and oppressive, and within it move shapes. Glimpses of movement that might be enemies or might be tricks of the light. Sound carries strangely, muffled in some sections and amplified in others, making it impossible to judge distance or direction. Explorers report feeling watched constantly, unseen eyes tracking their movements, malevolent intelligences studying them from the shadows. Time constraints add to the stress. Space hulks do not remain in real space indefinitely. They translate back into the warp seemingly at random, sometimes after hours, sometimes after weeks. Any boarding party still aboard when translation occurs is trapped, pulled into the Imperium along with the Hulk. This creates constant pressure to work quickly, to map the Hulk and recover valuables as fast as possible. But rushing leads to mistakes, to missed dangers, to ambushes and traps that might have been avoided with more careful approach. The Imperium tracks known space hulks, cataloguing their appearances and attempting to predict their movements. Some hulks follow semi-regular patterns, translating back into real space near the same regions repeatedly. These hulks acquire names and reputations. The Sin of Damnation, perhaps the most infamous space hulk, has been encountered multiple times over the centuries, and each encounter has resulted in heavy casualties among the forces sent to explore it. The Hulk appears. Imperial forces board it, hoping to recover valuable technology. Most of those forces die or disappear, and then the Hulk vanishes back into the warp, carrying its secrets and its victims away. Other Hulks appear without warning, emerging from the warp near critical locations like forge worlds or fortress systems. These sudden appearances can be catastrophic if the Hulk contains hostile forces. A Hulk carrying thousands of orcs or a Genestealer infestation can threaten an entire world if not dealt with quickly. Imperial forces must scramble to intercept these hulks, boarding them to assess the threat, and either destroying them entirely or clearing them of inhabitants before they can launch an attack. The process of destroying a space hulk is not simple. These structures are enormous, often larger than Imperial cities, and they're incredibly resilient. They've survived who knows how long drifting through the warp, weathering psychic storms that would tear normal ships apart. Conventional weapons often prove inadequate, even nova cannons. The most powerful weapons in the Imperial arsenal might only damage sections of the hulk rather than destroying it entirely. And destroying a hulk means potentially losing whatever valuable technology it contains, a waste that the Adeptus Mechanicus fights against, even when destruction is clearly the safer option. For those who become trapped within a space hulk, either as original crew when their ship joined the mass, or as boarding parties who were aboard when the hulk translated to the warp, the experience is uniquely hellish. They exist within a structure that is constantly shifting, sections of the hulk rearranging themselves, familiar corridors becoming mazes, rooms appearing and disappearing seemingly at random. Food and water are scarce, requiring scavenging from whatever supplies remain on the various ships. And the knowledge that demons, genestealers, orcs, and other horrors lurk in the darkness creates constant paranoia, making sleep nearly impossible, turning every sound into a potential threat. Some trapped explorers have survived for months or even years within space hulks, finding ways to evade the various threats, subsisting on minimal resources, hoping against hope that the hulk will translate back to real space, near an Imperial world, where they might signal for rescue. But the psychological damage from such an existence is profound. Those few who are rescued often emerge mad, their minds broken by long exposure to the hulk's corrupting influence, unable to readjust to normal life, haunted by memories of what they experienced in the darkness between stars. Different fates, by faction. The experience of being trapped in the warp varies considerably depending on one's species and faction. The warp responds to consciousness, to psychic presence, and different species interact with the Imperium in fundamentally different ways. What might be a death sentence for an unprotected human could be merely uncomfortable for an orc, or irrelevant to a necron. Understanding these differences provides insight into the nature of the warp itself and the ways different civilizations have adapted to deal with its dangers. For baseline humans, those without psychic abilities or the protection of power armor and other advanced equipment, being trapped in the warp is almost always fatal within hours or days. The human mind and body are simply not evolved to cope with the environment of the Imperium. The psychological assault breaks most minds quickly, and the physical mutations render the body non-viable even faster. Most humans exposed to raw warp energies either die outright from the shock or descend into madness and are quickly claimed by demons. Human psychers face a different, arguably worse fate. Their psychic abilities make them more aware of the warp, more sensitive to its currents and inhabitants. Where a normal human might only dimly sense the presence of demons, a psyker sees them clearly, experiences their attention as a physical pressure. Psykers are also more valuable to demons, their souls brighter and more nourishing than baseline humans. This makes them priority targets for possession and consumption. An untrained psyker trapped in the warp has almost no chance of survival. They become beacons, their psychic presence drawing every demon in the vicinity like moths to flame. Within minutes, they're overwhelmed, possessed, or consumed, their bodies transformed into gates through which demons can pour into real space. Even trained psykers, those who have undergone the rigorous instruction of the Scholastica Psychana, struggle to survive prolonged warp exposure. Their training helps them resist possession and control their powers enough not to inadvertently summon demons, but they still face tremendous strain, and many eventually break under the pressure. Space Marines, the Emperor's finest warriors, are far more resilient than baseline humans. Their genetic enhancements include psychological conditioning that helps them resist chaos corruption. Their power armor provides physical protection and sophisticated autosenses that filter out some of the most disorienting aspects of warp exposure. Their training emphasizes mental discipline, prayer, and absolute faith in the Emperor, all of which help maintain sanity in the face of horror. But even Space Marines are not invulnerable. Their enhanced physiology makes them more resistant to mutation, but not immune. Given sufficient time and exposure, even Astartes' flesh will begin to change. Their psychological conditioning can delay, but not prevent the erosion of sanity that the warp induces. And their very faith can become a weakness. Demons specifically targeting their beliefs, corrupting their devotion, turning their certainty into fanaticism that serves chaos instead of the Emperor. History has shown that entire chapters of Space Marines can fall to chaos corruption if trapped in the warp long enough. The traitor legions, those Space Marines who sided with Horus during his heresy, now dwell primarily within the Eye of Terror and other regions where the warp bleeds into real space. 10,000 years of exposure to chaos energies has transformed many of them into something far different from the noble warriors they once were. Some retain their intelligence and tactical acumen, but have embraced the dark gods, using their blessings to enhance their combat capabilities. Others have devolved into mindless berserkers or monstrous things that bear little resemblance to their original forms. Librarians, the Psyker Space Marines, face particular danger when trapped in the warp. Their psychic abilities make them aware of threats that their non-Psyker brothers cannot perceive, allowing them to better prepare defenses. But those same abilities also make them targets, and the strain of constantly fending off demonic assault, while also trying to protect their battle brothers, can exhaust even the most powerful librarian. Many choose to sacrifice themselves, channeling lethal amounts of psychic power to hold back the demons long enough for their brothers to escape or complete critical objectives, burning out their own minds and bodies in the process. The Eldar, that ancient race of psychic beings, are even more vulnerable to the warp than humans in some ways. Every Eldar possesses psychic abilities to some degree, and their souls burn brighter in the warp than human souls. This makes them incredibly attractive to demons, particularly to Slaanesh, the chaos god that was birthed by the fall of the Eldar civilization. Slaanesh has a special claim on Eldar souls, and any Eldar who dies has their soul drawn into the warp to be consumed by the Prince of Pleasure unless they're protected by a spirit stone. For this reason, the Eldar avoid the warp entirely when possible. They use the webway, an ancient network of tunnels through real space created by their ancestors, to travel between the stars. The webway isolates travelers from the warp, allowing faster-than-light travel without the risks of immaterium exposure. But the webway has been damaged in many places, sections collapsed or breached, and sometimes Eldar are forced to either use the warp directly or become trapped when portions of the webway fail. An Eldar trapped in the warp faces a nightmare that would destroy a human almost instantly. Their psychic senses are assaulted by every horror of the immaterium with an intensity that would kill lesser beings. They can feel Slaanesh's attention like a weight crushing down on them, the dark god's hunger for their soul a constant pressure. Most Eldar would choose death over warp exposure, preferring to die in real space where their spirit stone can capture their soul rather than risk being taken alive into the immaterium. Orcs, by contrast, seem remarkably resistant to warp corruption. The exact mechanism for this resistance is not fully understood, but it appears to be related to their unique psychic field. Orcs are psychers in a sense, though they don't think of themselves that way. Their collective belief shapes reality around them, making things work simply because the orcs think they should work. This psychic effect appears to provide a kind of natural protection against the warp. Orcs use space hulks as regular transportation without the sophisticated Geller fields that human ships require. They simply pack themselves into whatever structure is available and ride it through the warp, emerging at their destination with minimal casualties. The demons seem to have less interest in orc souls, perhaps because orc consciousness is less complex and therefore less satisfying to consume. Or perhaps the orc's latent psychic abilities create a field that repels demonic attention without the orcs even being aware they're doing so. This doesn't mean orcs are completely immune to chaos corruption. There have been cases of orc warbands falling to the influence of Khorne, becoming even more violent and bloodthirsty than normal orcs. But such corruption is rare, and most orcs seem able to survive in environments that would doom humans within hours. This makes them particularly dangerous when they use space hulks as invasion vehicles, because they arrive at their destinations still combat-ready, while human defenders must deal with any chaos taint or genestealer infestations that might also be aboard the Hulk. The Tau, that young species new to the galactic stage, have minimal experience with the warp. Their souls cast only dim shadows in the Imperium, making them almost invisible to demons. This is both blessing and curse. The blessing is that Tau are not attractive prey for warp entities, allowing them to survive exposure that would destroy other species. The curse is that this also means they have little natural psychic ability, making them unable to develop the kinds of protections that psykers can create. Tau ships use a different method of faster-than-light travel, one that doesn't require deep warp immersion. They skim along the surface of the Imperium rather than diving deep into it, making short hops that are safer but slower than true warp travel. This limits their ability to project power across galactic distances, but keeps them safer from chaos corruption. When Tau do encounter the warp directly, their responses tend to be pragmatic and technological rather than spiritual, viewing demons as a natural phenomenon to be studied and countered rather than as metaphysical evil to be fought with faith. The Necrons and Tyranids represent extremes at opposite ends of the spectrum. Necrons, being soulless mechanical beings, are completely immune to warp corruption. Demons cannot possess machines that have no souls. Chaos cannot tempt beings that feel no emotion. The warp's psychological assaults are meaningless against minds that exist as programs running on hardware rather than as organic consciousness. For this reason, Necrons don't use the warp for travel at all, preferring their own dimension-crossing technology. Tyranids are biological creatures, but they're controlled by a hive mind that exists partially outside normal space. This hive mind seems to have its own presence in the warp, a shadow that demons find distasteful or disturbing. Where Tyranids go in large numbers, the warp becomes muted, the normal psychic turbulence dampened by the hive mind's influence. This creates what the Imperium calls the shadow in the warp, a region where psychic powers become difficult or impossible to use. The Tyranid hive mind appears to displace or suppress the warp rather than being affected by it. Notable cases and historical examples. Throughout the Imperium's long history, there have been numerous documented cases of ships and crew trapped in the warp, stories that serve as warnings and case studies for those who study the dangers of warp travel. While many such incidents are lost to time or suppressed by the Inquisition, certain cases have become famous or infamous within military and naval circles, studied by officers and tech priests seeking to understand what went wrong and how similar disasters might be prevented. The most famous case outside of official Imperial records is probably that of the Event Horizon, a vessel that predates the Imperium itself, allegedly from the Dark Age of technology. According to fragmentary records, this ship was an experimental vessel equipped with a prototype warp drive, technology that would eventually evolve into the drives used by modern Imperial ships. On its maiden voyage, something went catastrophically wrong. The ship entered the warp, but failed to translate back to real space at its intended destination. When a rescue mission finally located the Event Horizon years later, they found a ship transformed into something that barely resembled its original design. The interior had been corrupted in ways that suggested prolonged warp exposure without adequate protection. The crew was dead or missing, and the few recorded logs that remained suggested they had experienced the full horror of unprotected warp immersion. The rescue team itself suffered terrible losses, many members succumbing to madness or mutation before they could escape. The event horizon was eventually destroyed, but its story lives on as a cautionary tale about the dangers of warp travel without proper safeguards. Within the current era, one of the most well-documented cases involves the Blood Ravens chapter of Space Marines and a space hulk called the Judgment of Carrion. This hulk appears periodically in subsector Aurelia, drifting between the warp and real space in patterns that seem almost deliberate. 500 standard years before the present, elements of the Blood Ravens' Fifth Company, led by epistolary Azariah Kairos, boarded the hulk during one of its appearances in real space. The boarding action went catastrophically wrong. The hulk translated back into the warp while the Blood Ravens were still aboard, trapping them in the Imperium without warning. The Space Marines fought desperately to survive, battling not just the demons that infested the hulk, but also the slow corruption that prolonged warp exposure induces. Kyrus made contact with a greater demon, a powerful entity that offered the Blood Ravens a way out of their predicament in exchange for a terrible price. The exact nature of the bargain remains classified, but its results were clear. The Fifth Company escaped the hulk, returning to real space and rejoining their chapter. They were welcomed as heroes, survivors of an impossible ordeal, but the corruption had taken root. Over the centuries that followed, Kairos rose through the chapter's ranks, eventually becoming chapter master. And all the while, he spread the taint of chaos through the Blood Ravens, corrupting those around him, preparing the chapter for eventual betrayal. The truth only emerged when loyalist Blood Ravens boarded the Judgment of Carrion again, seeking to understand what had happened to Kyrus and the Fifth Company. They discovered evidence of the pact with the demon, proof that their chapter master had been corrupted during his time trapped in the warp. This led to a civil war within the chapter, loyalists fighting against those who had fallen to chaos, a conflict that decimated Blood Ravens' forces and left scars that the chapter carries to this day. The case of the Imperial frigate Eisenstein provides another well-documented example. This one from the Horus Heresy. This ship, carrying loyal Space Marines fleeing from the betrayal at Istvan III, suffered severe damage to its Geller field during its desperate flight to Terra. For hours, the ship traveled through the warp with only partial protection, the damaged field flickering and failing at irregular intervals. During those failures, demons manifested aboard the ship. The crew fought desperate battles against entities they had no training to combat, creatures that violated every law of reality they understood. Many died. More were corrupted. The ship's remembrancer, a human historian assigned to document the Great Crusade, was possessed by a demon and had to be killed. The Death Guard Marines aboard, some of whom had already been exposed to Nurgle's plague during the betrayal at Istvan, showed signs of rapid corruption, their flesh beginning the transformations that would eventually turn them into plague Marines. Despite these horrors, the Eisenstein made it to Terra, arriving with its warning about Horus's betrayal. But the cost was severe. The ship was so contaminated that it had to be completely destroyed after the survivors disembarked. Many of those survivors were never quite the same, haunted by what they had experienced, jumping at shadows, unable to fully trust even their closest companions. The case became legendary within the Imperium, as an example of loyalty and determination triumphing over impossible odds, but also as a stark reminder of what warp exposure can do, even to the strongest warriors. Another notable incident involves an entire sector of space known as the Jericho Reach, which was cut off from the rest of the Imperium for centuries by warp storms. Ships attempting to enter or leave the sector were destroyed or driven mad. Those few that managed to survive the passage emerged with their crews corrupted or dead, their navigation systems useless, unable to provide accurate information about what they had experienced. When the warp storms finally subsided enough to allow safe passage, the Imperium launched the Achilles Crusade to reclaim the Jericho Reach. What they found was a region that had been drastically changed by its isolation. Some worlds had fallen to chaos worship. Others had been overrun by Xenos forces. Still others had developed into strange, isolated societies that had evolved their own cultures and technologies during their centuries of separation. The process of bringing the sector back into imperial compliance took decades and cost millions of lives. The accounts of those who survived the warp storms during the isolation period are particularly disturbing. Ships trapped in the storms often experienced subjective time periods that didn't match external reality. Crews might believe they had been in the warp for days, only to emerge and discover that decades had passed in real space. Or conversely, they might experience months or years of subjective time, while only hours passed outside. This temporal displacement created situations where ship crews had aged significantly, while their families and comrades on nearby worlds had barely aged at all, or where military units arrived at their destinations to find the wars they were sent to fight had been over for generations. There are also cases that remain classified, known only to the highest levels of the Inquisition and the Adeptus Mechanicus. Ships that encountered things in the warp that shouldn't exist, even by the standards of that reality-defying realm. Vessels that returned with crew members claiming to have met the Emperor himself, walking through the corridors of their ships, though such claims are obviously impossible and suggest severe corruption or madness. Ships that emerged from the warp at locations that should have been unreachable, as if the Imperium had carried them not just through space, but through dimensions, depositing them in alternate realities or possible futures. One recurring pattern in these accounts is that survival often depends more on luck and the whims of the warp itself than on any action the crew might take. The most skilled navigator, the most experienced captain, the most faithful crew, all can do little against the fundamental chaos of the Imperium. Protection helps. Geller fields, prayer, mental discipline, all these things increase the odds of survival. But ultimately, ships trapped in the warp survive or fail to survive based on factors beyond mortal control, subject to the mercy of forces that have no mercy, at the whim of entities that delight in suffering. Conclusion. Why death would be mercy? To be trapped in the warp is to experience existence stripped of all the comfortable assumptions that make life bearable. It is to discover that reality itself is not a fixed, stable foundation, but rather a thin shell over an abyss of churning chaos. It is to learn that consciousness, that precious spark that defines us as individuals, as beings capable of thought and choice and identity, can be violated in ways that physical torture could never achieve. It is, in short, to confront the ultimate horror, the final proof that the universe is not designed for human existence, and that we survive only through the most fragile of protections. Death in the material universe, while feared, carries with it certain assumptions about continuity and meaning. We understand that our physical forms will decay, that our consciousness will cease, but we believe or hope that something persists, some essential essence that might continue in some form. The Emperor protects, the faithful are taught, and the righteous dead will find peace in his eternal embrace. Whether this is true or not, the belief provides comfort, but the warp offers no such comfort. Souls consumed by demons do not persist as individuals. They are torn apart, their psychic energy absorbed into the essence of chaos entities, their memories and personalities dissolved like salt in water until nothing remains that could be called you in any meaningful sense. This is not death, but obliteration, the complete erasure of everything that made you who you were. Even those who survive warp exposure, who somehow endure and eventually escape back to real space, are forever changed. The corruption cannot be fully cleansed. The memories cannot be erased. They carry with them always the knowledge of what they experienced, the weight of having witnessed things that should not exist, that violate every principle of how reality is supposed to function. Many survivors suffer from what Imperial medical personnel call warp shock, a condition that resembles but is far worse than conventional trauma. They jump at shadows. They cannot trust their own perceptions. never certain whether what they're experiencing is real or another hallucination. They often turn to extreme faith or madness, finding no middle ground between fanatic devotion and complete mental breakdown. The psychological scars manifest in ways that make normal life impossible. Survivors cannot maintain relationships because they cannot trust anyone fully, always suspicious that their loved ones might be possessed or corrupted. They cannot find pleasure in ordinary activities because everything pales in comparison to the intensity of their warp experiences. They cannot sleep without nightmares, cannot eat without nausea, cannot exist without constantly being pulled back to those moments of absolute horror. For those who were not merely exposed but transformed, who carry visible mutations or permanent corruption, the situation is even worse. The Imperium does not tolerate chaos taint. Those who return from warp exposure bearing the marks of mutation are not welcomed as survivors, but rather treated as walking contamination. They are often executed outright, or if they're valuable enough to warrant the expense, subjected to brutal purification rituals that might cleanse the taint but often kill the subject in the process. There is no return to normal life for the visibly corrupted. There is only death, either quick and merciful or slow and agonizing. This is why death is mercy. A clean death, dying in battle or from accident or disease, offers the release of oblivion. Consciousness ends. Pain stops. There is no continued suffering, no degradation, no corruption. For those facing the choice between death and warp exposure, death is always the better option. The Imperium recognizes this, which is why ship crews are trained to destroy their vessels rather than allow them to be captured and dragged into the warp, why commanders issue final orders for self-destruction when Geller field failure is detected, why last-ditch measures are always preferable to capture by chaos forces. The theology of the imperial cult supports this view. To die in service to the Emperor is the greatest honor a servant of the Imperium can achieve. The soul joins the Emperor in his eternal vigil, or so the faithful believe. But to be corrupted by chaos is to be denied this honor, to have one's soul claimed by the dark gods rather than joining with the Emperor's light. Death before corruption is not just practical survival advice, but a religious imperative, a way of ensuring that one's soul goes to the Emperor rather than to chaos. Yet despite all these horrors, despite the clear evidence that warp travel is inherently dangerous, and that being trapped in the Imperium is a fate worse than death, the Imperium continues to use the warp. Because there is no choice. The Imperium spans 1,000,000 worlds across the galaxy. Without the ability to travel through the warp, without faster-than-light communication, this empire would fragment into isolated systems within years. Trade would collapse. Military coordination would become impossible. The unity that keeps humanity from being overrun by Xenos races or falling to chaos worship would evaporate, and so the ships continue to sail through the warp, tens of thousands of vessels making the journey every day. Most make it through safely. Their crews experience the usual discomforts of warp travel, the nausea and temporal displacement and vague sense of wrongness, but they arrive at their destinations intact and functional. They deliver their cargo, disembark their passengers, complete their missions, and return home with nothing more terrible to report than another routine voyage through the Imperium. But always, there are those who do not return, ships that vanish without trace, their fate unknown but certainly terrible. Vessels that emerge from the warp damaged and corrupted, bearing horrors within their hulls. Hulks that drift through the Imperium, tombs filled with the remains of crews who learned too late what it means to be trapped in the warp. These are the price the Imperium pays for maintaining its unity, the cost in lives and souls that galactic civilization demands. The nightmare of being trapped in the warp is not a rare occurrence, not an unusual fate that only befalls the unlucky few. It is a constant presence hanging over every ship that enters the Imperium, a possibility that becomes reality for some unfortunate souls every single day. The crews who make that journey know the risks. They have heard the stories. They have seen the survivors, those rare few who made it back, and witnessed what the experience did to them. And yet they go anyway, because duty demands it, because the Imperium requires their service, because there is no other way to keep humanity's empire from collapsing into isolated fragments. This is the true horror of the warp, not just what it does to those who become trapped within it, but the knowledge that it is necessary. That for all its dangers, for all the suffering it causes, for all the souls it claims, the warp remains essential to human survival in the 41st millennium. The alternative to using the warp is not a safer but slower form of travel. The alternative is extinction, humanity reduced to isolated worlds, picked off one by enemies that can coordinate across galactic distances. And so the ships keep flying, the navigators keep guiding them through that realm of chaos, and every day some crews make it home, while others never will. If you found this exploration of warp travel's darkest aspects enlightening, please like this video and subscribe to Stories of Hammer for more deep dives into the lore of Warhammer 40K. The universe of 40,000 is vast and filled with horrors that deserve to be understood. Until next time, remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, and some fates are far worse than death.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.